Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second event of our Inclusion Week series. On behalf of everybody here at REI, we'd like to welcome everybody, and we will start today's session. So to begin our session, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. And joining me to do this land acknowledgement will be the speakers for this panel this afternoon. Hi. So let me begin. As this meeting is virtual, we are not all gathered in the same space. We recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you're currently on. We ask that if this is the case, that you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders.
Do I start?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you, everyone. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University.
York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat.
This area is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation.
This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Pump Belt Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region.
And we'd like to invite my colleague Darcy to lead a short reflection on the land acknowledgement.
Thank you so much, Carol, and everyone. Want to express some gratitude for providing that land acknowledgement. We want to provide a bit of a reflection to situate the land acknowledgement within the conversation that we're having today. The annex to the 2007 United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples provides as a guiding principle the need to recognize that respect for Indigenous knowledge, cultures, and traditional practices contributes to sustainable and equitable development, as well as proper management of the environment. So you can see that the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples situates sustainability. Some of the ways that Indigenous peoples across the globe resist the disproportionate impacts of, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic are voluntary isolation, applying Indigenous medicinal knowledges, closing access to territories, youth activism to spread preventative measures and techniques, to name only a few. As Indigenous peoples work to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19, for example, they're also working to protect their traditions in their own ways. So, with sustainable approaches in mind, I want to ask that throughout this presentation, we all take the opportunity to be and remain open to thinking about sustainability, not as a kind of a monolithic aspiration that has a few bright line answers, but as a concept that manifests according to the unique lived and historical experiences of each one of us and our communities. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Darcy. Now I'd like to turn it over to our Executive Director, Marian Mcgregor.
Well, thank you very much, Carol and Darcy, for that reflection. We began Inclusion Week 2022 yesterday with our workshop on allyship and continue today with this, our first panel of the series. We believe that this panel's topic will resonate with many of you because rest is an issue that it connects to important aspects of our ever-changing world of work. However, by asking the question of who gets to rest, we are intentionally framing the question as an unapologetically political question, one that is intrinsically linked to a host of equity and social justice issues. This year's Inclusion Week theme is about building and sustaining equitable and caring futures. And this series is meant to offer opportunities for everyone to reflect on how, as communities, we can safeguard the wellness of those who bear the brunt of inequalities and harms. Even as the pandemic brought inequalities into starker contrast, and there are encouraging signs of hope for building communities and solidarity, political polarization is also on the rise. Some of us may even have direct experience of this in our daily conflict with our neighbors, our family members. Joining us today for this intimate fireside chat are panelists whose life work in academia as well as in social justice activism can provide us with compelling perspectives that can lead us to think more critically about how rest is a collective issue of equity and justice. Today's panelists include Associate Professor Soma Chatterjee in the School of Social Work at the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, Associate Professor Ethel Tungohan in the Department of Politics in the Faculty of LA&PS, and Olatoye, my apologies, Ola, and Alana Broomfield, co-presidents of York University's Black and Indigenous Varsity Student Athletic Alliance, or BIVSAA. Without further ado, I'll leave you to hear the insights from these highly esteemed individuals. And thank you all for attending and making this time to learn and unlearn. Thank you.
Thanks, Marian. So I won't go into any more additional introductions, but we wanted to go over some housekeeping rules. We organized this panel. You've received the invitations to a fireside chat. Couldn't actually get the fire. This is the closest that I got, but it's a format we hope will be more intimate and engaged. So this was very intentional on our part. This gives us a chance to step out of the usual modes of delivering and listening to talks in the academe where speakers make a point, lay down formal arguments, and then defend them without necessarily creating or finding opportunities to engage in meaningful conversations with their co-panelists. So there will be guiding questions, of course, to frame our conversation, but we also want to give the conversation room to branch out. So this is a little bit of improv. Fear not. And we want it to develop as organically as possible. The first question will be some sort of invitation for our speakers to say what they find the most compelling in our topic. They can describe an aspect of their work, their activism, it doesn't have to take too long. And if they like, they can pose a question for other panelists. I will certainly do my best as a moderator to help this process along. Now, as you have noted, we have interpretation for French. We also have ASL. And for those who require support, because as much as we want to engage, even animated conversation, some of the things we will discuss will probably be rough, kind of serious. So if at any moment you require support, some of my colleagues will be, waiting in another Zoom room, and you can join them. If you need some quiet space or even support, feel free to do that. Now, Towards the second half of the conversation, we'll be entertaining questions. There's a Q&A feature. That's the wonder of this webinar format. And we can also read out some interesting audience comments. I believe some of my colleagues will also be helping me sift through those questions. And in the last 10 to 15 minutes, we will wrap up, have a few final words, at which point we actually very much encourage, so this is for the speakers, to mention a part of the conversation or what another speaker mentioned that they found the most enlightening and thought-provoking, right? So let's begin. For our first round, maybe we can go the order of Soma, Ethel, Ola, and then Alana. Give us your thoughts about the question. You can even answer, who gets to rest? Soma? Oh, Soma, I think you might be muted. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this panel. I really welcome the opportunity to be with Ethel, who I have spoken with before a couple of times, and especially this time with our student leaders, Ola and Alana. So I'm really looking forward. I have to acknowledge that I come to you today with a bit of a heavy heart. These are indeed very restless times for our world. You know, the last 2 years have taken a lot from us. And just as we were thinking that we are coming out even a little bit out of it, we are in the middle. I mean, we are witnessing a war whose consequences, like to use a cliche, will be far, far reaching. Like we don't even know yet, right? But to go back to the question that brought us here today, like many of us during the pandemic, I have been quite exhausted, and an exhausted academic, what they do, they start thinking about exhaustion theoretically and politically. So that's what I did. I actually ended up thinking a lot about exhaustion, rest, and recuperation. And I like the way this question has been, like the question of rest has been framed by this, forum, because the matter of rest is often posed in a way that kind of make us self-critical, like we are inundated with advice and strategies and all of that. I remember having asked for some help during the pandemic, institutional support, and I actually was told that, okay, we can help you carry the same workload by helping you strategize. So it's just kind of makes us feel like, more inadequate, like as if, the solutions are out there. I just don't know enough. So that's why I like this question actually, because who gets to rest is fundamentally different from how can I better manage so I can open up some time for rest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who gets to rest offers clarity on why some of us are kind of exhausted now, while some others get to judge us, give us advice, and in some cases actually can determine whether we get rest or not. It is an opportunity to get clarity on why my rest has to be at the expense, like always has to be at the expense of someone else's. Like, and this is where Ethel's work is like so crucial, that I am allowed to rest only when I can buy care, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I have been told actually, why can't you hire a nanny, right? And I'm going to kind of talk about it if opportunity comes later. There were so many assumptions comes with that apparently simple question, right?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I like the question because this takes us directly to the systems of power and privilege. And so I'm going to just end this part of my comments by saying that this is why I am really interested, and I will hope we get some opportunity to talk about this mantra of we are in this together during the pandemic that we were bombarded with, and that actually erases these power relations, right? and hierarchies in the university. We are in this together. The way I see it actually made it possible for our post-secondary institutions to disregard support for faculty with intersecting experiences and intersecting challenges, including those with caregiving duties. And this led to a crisis of rest. And if you ask me personally, it actually led to a crisis of faith, whether at all the post-secondary can be a place where care work is valued and not only looked at as an hindrance that needs to be overcome by strategizing, right? And so I hope that what we can do today in this fireside chat together in our own messy ways, it doesn't have to be super put together and organized, but if we can think about a culture of care, the possibilities about, possibilities of a culture of care in this relentlessly productivity oriented institutions that we are part of. So I'm going to stop there for now, and I'm looking
Thanks,
forward
Soma.
to hearing. Yeah.
Definitely lots of to think about there and unpack. You can go next, Ethel. Yes.
Thank you so much, Soma, for starting us off on a really provocative set of reflections. And thank you again for inviting me to be part of this panel, Carol. I really, truly appreciate it. When I think of the question, who gets to rest, I immediately feel defensive because I feel, well, not me, not me. And I think we need to widen the question to ask ourselves, rather than thinking of individuals and which individuals get to rest, we need to think about the systemic issues facing communities that make it harder for certain communities to rest. The pandemic has revealed so clearly to a lot of us that there are rampant gender inequalities, racial inequalities, inequalities born out of ability and disability that prohibit some communities from being able to rest. The burden of keeping institutions going, the burden of keeping institutions functioning and the burden of keeping families going during the pandemic are gendered and are racialized and are also classed. And so when I think who gets to rest, I want to look at structural realities that make it harder for some people to rest. And here, let's look inwards and let's reflect on our own practices within the institution of York. Why is it that we're living in a pandemic? We haven't really thought of, for instance, in certain classes, ways to make learning easier for students during the pandemic. Why haven't we integrated that into our pedagogies, right? Some professors have, certainly, I've heard of that. Others haven't, right? They don't take into account, some of the stresses that students face, how sometimes being on Zoom for 3 hours is just incredibly fatiguing, how students at York, some of my students, have had to assume care work responsibilities because their parents are working, paid work, paid essential jobs, while also being in school full time. So I think the question, who gets to rest, sadly for me, highlights how it's become an individual issue. We haven't thought about these structures of power. We haven't thought about these systems of power that prevent some communities from resting. I'd also like to acknowledge that this is probably the start of the third year of the pandemic. And the question, who gets to rest, which I think it individualizes the problem, makes it seem as though people who aren't able to rest, despite all of the pressures they're facing, that this is your individual shortcoming, right? This is why you have all of these Instagram influencers who, extol the virtues of yoga and meditation. This is why you've got a lot of apps, which I actually subscribe to, such as Headspace, that say, maybe if you're in the washroom, you can just meditate, carve out a little something for yourself so you can rest. And I think this assumes, first of all, that the issue of who gets to rest isn't structural. It individualizes the problem, right? I also keep thinking about, because my work is on immigration, about the tremendous privilege we have in even being able to sit in this panel to unpack who gets to rest, knowing that essential workers, essential migrant workers, whose labor has been so crucial in ensuring that Canadian society and our societies worldwide are able to survive through the pandemic, that societies keep going. A lot of these people wouldn't have had the privilege to be able to talk in a fireside chat about whether they get to rest, because they just have to keep working, right? So my own work looked at migrant care workers who work in long-term care homes, who work in households. And the reality is, in terms of structural imbalances of power, they can't ask if they can rest because policies make it such that they cannot. So for instance, there are no provisions for paid sick leave for some of these sectors, right?
Yes.
So I'll end my comments by highlighting first that in order to answer this question, we have to look at these structural inequities, right? Second, we shouldn't feel guilty if we're not able to rest because there are structural reasons preventing us from being able to rest. And also there is a backlash that some of us face if we do decide to rest. And by that, I mean, some of us can simply, some of us, for instance, who choose to email people, who choose to email our superiors and say, look, I can't meet this deadline because I have so and so and so responsibilities. Some of us will face resistance to that because some people will say, well, aren't you just kind of making excuses, right? So I want to acknowledge that not all of us have the luxury of being able to demand our right to rest because of the backlash we face, which is born out of these other systemic issues as well. And finally, the last note I'll end on is that we need to figure out what it is that we mean by rest, because there are different definitions of rest, right? So when we think about resting, automatically we think, oh, someone's lying down in their bed with a heated blanket, they're sleeping. That might be one area of rest. But there have been a number of nights during the pandemic when I'm lying down in my bed, but my mind is still racing. So even if physically I'm trying to rest, I cannot, because of all of the other worries that I have, worries that have been exacerbated by the pandemic, right? And so we have to kind of think about what we mean by rest. Maybe it's not that. Maybe rest can also entail, having the time to go boxing. I've become a boxer during the pandemic, right? So you can stop thinking and you can just kind of, do something physical so your mind can stop worrying, right? So let's puncture this notion that there are universal standards of rest. And let's also, again, look at these structural issues, and let's not blame ourselves if we cannot rest because of these larger systemic issues and the backlash that some of us may face if we try to seize our right to rest.
Thank you so much for that, Ethel. Now I expect everybody who's watching, the gears in your minds are already working because of those contributions so far. Let's get going. And, I'd like to hear from Ola and then Alana.
Yes, hi. Thank you for having me in this panel. Very excited, a little bit nervous.
Don't be.
Yeah, so when I think of rest too, I do get defensive, as Ethel was saying, saying, not me, as a student, not me as a Black woman, absolutely not. And what I think about in this conversation, it's if you're not in the top 20% wealthy power, then no one below you gets rest. And also what Ethel was saying about the policies that have been placed, I think the pandemic had really shown that now the people that used to be living with paycheck to paycheck, weren't living at all. How were they surviving? And the narrative kind of got, well, in my thoughts, I think the narrative switched, saying that it was their fault that they were living to paycheck, and it's their fault that they're not working hard. But in the society, they don't care about the people that are not have power or privilege to help themselves, or not helping them to get out of the bottom 20%. And that's very concerning. And how can we even live in a society where we're not doing our best to help people who are struggling and pointing the fingers that, you know, it's your fault that you're there in the first place, which is not. There's policies in place that are only helping the wealthy get wealthier, and there's a huge gap. And I don't think in our time we see like, hopefully in our time we can see the gap shrink, and then everybody will be kind of in the same level. But I think the pandemic has showed that it is a structural and systematic,
Mm-hmm.
and that takes time to change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for pointing that out, Ola. And you know, just to reinforce what and support what Ola said, I recently read that only about 20% of people employed in Canada were able to shift to working from home because, you know, not all jobs can be done from home, right? And most of those jobs turn out to be supervisory, managerial, you know, the majority of the work uh, that already, you know, has a higher position in terms of income. So let's go to Alana.
Hi,
Hi.
thank you for having me again. I feel honored to just be a part of this panel, especially with the two professors. I've already learned so much in just your little spiel at the beginning. But when I first thought about who gets to rest, I kind of on the same length as Ola saying, I'm a university student. Like, I don't know what rest is. Like, at this point, I don't know what sleep is. And I think that just comes from, I guess, being drilled that you work hard now and you can sleep later, you can rest later, or have fun later. So the way I try to reformulate the question is, I guess, under the basis of working through BIVSAA and social justice and trying to make active change. And I try to reformulate it to who deserves to rest. And like Ethel was saying, I changed the definition of rest in the sense of just relaxing and not applying so much pressure, not so much sleeping and, you know, having and going into like REM sleep or anything like that. So I was kind of exploring who deserves to rest. And I think that's when we can go further and say, okay, the people that are working endlessly to try to stop oppression or try to minimize it and working endless hours to try to promote equity and do active change like that. And even though they do deserve to rest, it still doesn't mean that they are resting because they know that the work is never done and it won't be done for a while. And I think that they accepted that. So yes, they deserve to rest, and I believe that they deserve to rest as well. REI, everyone here, they deserve to rest, but will they rest? No, because the type of people that I guess we are resilient. We want to see the change, and we might not see it right now, but we feel like we're getting closer. So that's how I kind of viewed the question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Alana. And of course, Alana is talking about, and I believe I've been reading your Twitter lately, Ethel. I believe Alana is also sort of mentioning the extra layer of work when it comes to being a social advocate for change, right? Uh, there is no rest for critical scholars like Soma, Ethel as well, who also engage in this. One thing I wanted to get back to, and that you, the panelists, sort of started, was to unpack the nature of the beast, that is the structural ways in which rest is made impossible or very, very challenging, you know, for certain sectors. And you can, you know, you can introduce examples, but feel free to also describe your work day, so to speak, you know, your academic load, and we'll get a conversation going about the patterns of work, you know, that we've encountered, that, you know, that really show us a good example of how rest is structurally prevented, you know, or made so impossible and challenging. Would you like to start, Ethel?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I spoke a little bit about, my work with migrant care workers and immigrant
Mm-hmm.
care workers. And I also work closely with migrant workers who work in essential industries.
Mm-hmm.
And on the one hand, I think about the challenges that we've all faced as people who work in universities and study in universities, but then I compare our situations to people working in essential industries during the pandemic. And I realized that there is a lot of like class-based inequalities here, inequalities based on status. And I think what's challenging is to think about kind of systemic fixes, right? So for instance, society during COVID won't be able to function without care workers, right? At the height of the pandemic, we relied on the labor of healthcare aides, personal support workers to work in long-term care homes. And, society without them wouldn't be able to function. But in my work with Filipina care workers in partnership with Migrant Resource Center Canada and Gabriela, Ontario, one of the things we saw was how awful some of the policies were. So for instance, I mentioned earlier that, prohibitions against taking time off because there wasn't paid sick leave, make it harder for people to rest. At the very beginning of the pandemic, some of the women weren't allowed to take days off because, simply put, these homes were understaffed. So some of these workplaces said you actually can't take time off because really we're understaffed, right? So if we look at it by sector, it's clear that we are tremendously privileged in even being able to discuss the question, who gets to rest? So that's kind of an example of a sector of workers who really like can't get rest, and even if they want to rest because they have to make ends meet, they can't take advantage of that opportunity because they have to assume other jobs in order to be able to pay for their subsistence in an expensive city like Toronto. I
Mm-hmm.
think for a lot of people who are parents, who are care workers in their own homes. And by that, I mean, perhaps people like me and Soma who also have childcare responsibilities, people who are in the sandwich generation, so to speak, right, where we also have elderly parents, that adds significantly to the stresses that we're facing as well. So the adage that we're not working from home, we're living at work is actually exceedingly true, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I don't want to kind of talk about like my day-to-day schedule because it varies, but I also want to acknowledge that it's not just about kind of the labor that we're doing, i.e. the paid work, right? Like my job is as a professor, or even the care work that we're doing, like taking care of my two young children and kind of doing acts of daily care, such as,
Mm-hmm.
feeding them and things like that. There's also the notion of emotional labor that I think some of our student
Yes.
activists have to, I'd be curious to hear their thoughts on this as well, because the time of COVID also coincided with
Mm-hmm.
a time of intense activism, especially surrounding the movement for Black lives, especially surrounding Indigenous communities, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so for a lot of people who are, immersed in these communities, emotional labor has to be exerted in teaching people why it's important to pay attention to these movements, and teaching even like friends and family members, oh, maybe your stereotypes aren't true, maybe this is why you should get involved, right? So there are all of these forms of labor. It's not just paid work, it's also emotional labor that we have to factor in when we think about the notion of rest. And I'll just end there, and I'm eager to
Mm-hmm.
hear what others have to say.
Oh, that was so good that you brought up emotional labor, and I hope the others talk about it too. But Soma, is there
Yeah,
a response you wanted? Yeah.
yeah. Okay, I'm unmuted, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you, Ethel. I really, that's just such insightful comments and powerful. I just want to say that my work is not really around this notion of care or care
Mhm.
work. I actually am drawing from my experience of living through the pandemic as a faculty member with this so-called a white collar job, a fair bit of protection from the ravages of the pandemic, and taking care of a kid and all of that, and learning about work and care work. the separation, and how that is structurally produced, how that actually reproduces the economic and the social system that we are struggling against, right? And so I'm going to actually try to let me try that. I want to actually reflect on how that relationship, that unequal, the social and class inequity that Ethel so insightfully laid out, how that actually was reproduced within the university during the pandemic, right? So I'm going to start with an example. So basically everyone knows there was no support for, no acknowledgement of care work and anything. And I one day I remember that I gave my daughter a book to read, and I kind of tried to open up, selfish way, I tried to open up half an hour for myself to get some work done. We were all working from home. My partner is also like teaching from home. It was around that time, the early days of the pandemic, and she comes back running to me in a minute and asking me, "Mama, can I get a bowl of rice and a chopstick?" I'm like, why? And she's like, "Oh, I'm reading this book about this Chinese girl who is, eating rice and chopstick, and I want to try." And I'm like, yeah. And, so that my giving me her that chopstick is not work. Playing tags with her is not work. Looking up Armenia on the map is definitely, I can never prove this to be work, although I'm at the same time grading, I'm supervising MRP, I'm planning a course on epistemology, but those are work. This is not work, right? So work, the whole distance, and then me being like someone asking me, and if that happened, and I'm going to name York University as that site where it happened, that why can't you hire a nanny? And as if I'll be okay with the deeply racialized, gendered, social and economic exchange. Like I will be okay with it. And I can only get rest and support if I can engage in, and if I want to engage in that exchange, right? So all of those relations got kind of reproduced in the university. And so that's what I learned, and what I want us to remember is that, this whole idea of white collar job, that's not only a class referent, I see it as a racial referent as well. So working with bodies, working with, grime and dirt and blood and sweat, all those work is not work. Work is cerebral, work is rational, work is male, work is white. So let's make sure that this whole idea of white collar job, is not only a class referent. And the fact, let's also make sure that these social inequities were reproduced. I mean, these are driven by Enlightenment principles, right?
Mhm.
That what is work, who is a rational, who is a thinker, and who is a worker.
Mhm.
When faculty got denied, their family status accommodation or support for care work, or, acknowledgement of care work, those were Enlightenment principles in operation within the university that claims to be an enlightened space,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? So
Yeah.
that's what I wanted to.
Thank you for that. Especially when you think about valuation of work, right? We are all aware that rest is, or quality rest for that matter, is a commodity. We're bombarded with ads for the best mattress, the best apps for meditation, gurus, etc. But the very workers, as Ethel and Soma have noted, who make rest a condition possible,
Mhm.
are the workers who don't tend to get paid much, right? Or even prohibited from resting. So again, that's a reality and a paradox of course, contemporary capitalist society where we live. But I was also interested in something Ethel mentioned regarding, on one hand, there's the piece that's structural. On the other hand, we have feelings of guilt. And I think Soma also touched on this when she said we tend to be blamed for uh, the lack of time It's just because you don't manage well. Wanted to hear how the students, you know, are taking this on, because our as we introduce them, our student leaders here are not only activists, you know, they're students with full loads, but they're also athletes. So, you know, so given the competing demands, you know, um, how do you move forward in terms of getting yourself some rest? You know, how do you claw back that time? Was interested in any strategies you might share.
I can start off.
Mhm.
Yeah, so as Carol mentioned, yeah, we're student athletes, and that means that we have to block out some time for competing and sometimes for practice, and then homework and assignments and stuff like that. So our time in the day gets really condensed. And I think one way that I've tried to stay on top of it is just time blocking every last hour of the day, like and I have to stick to that schedule, or else I find that my mental health starts to suffer because I get really bad anxiety that I didn't study enough, or I didn't put as much work or even time into practice or writing an assignment, or studying for a test. So I think time blocking really helped me. But then when the pandemic hit, I felt like I had all the time in the world. I was like, oh, I don't have to block out any time to commute. I can just go in and log in. But then, work started. There's no work. There's no part-time work for me anymore because everything was shut down. So I had to start finding maybe online jobs. So that cut my time in half, and just financial struggles. I thought that I had all this time, and by the end of it, I ended up working full-time hours, 5 days a week. So it was like I was like, I'm so confused. Like I thought I was gonna have time to rest. I thought this was going to
Mhm.
be my time to kind of refresh and really focus on my academics, because track and field wasn't happening at the time. But but then the financial elements come in, and I didn't find any rest. But yeah, that's kind of what uh, I guess what Ethel was saying earlier about the systematic side of rest, and how even though you think there may be an element of your life that is taking, maybe moving to the side, or coming to an end, there's always something else. And that's how I felt. I was like, oh my goodness, another load. And it seemed like it was like never ending. And now, even though this is quote unquote kind of back to normal, it's the same boom, 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 no rest, just as it was during the pandemic. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Thanks so much for that, Alana. And that's, you know, also connected to the emotional labor that Ethel definitely mentioned. Uh, Emotional labor required of managing the anxiety of finances, but also emotional labor that's usually expected of, let's face it, women, right? In society. So that's a very big part of the piece of care work, I believe, that Ethel was discussing. But I also wanted to ask, you know, because we've been talking about care work that is performed by certain sectors of society, and usually the migrants, you know, normally because societies aren't willing to pay much for this kinds of service. Um, I wanted to ask and invite, you know, just the speakers to talk about, you know, what you might have also been observing in terms of cultures around work. And I believe we touched on ideas about productivity, right? So for the professors, maybe talk about what productivity is, and you know what the expectations are from professors and scholars, and maybe from our student athletes. What does it look like? You know, what are the pressures for productivity to be considered an accomplished student athlete, and how does this contribute, to maybe harmful patterns of non-rest, you know, in our lives. So I'd like to do the round again, and if you could start, Ethel, much appreciated.
I think, sorry, Carol, Darcy had their hand up. I don't know.
Oh,
Oh,
Thank,
yeah, sorry.
hi,
thank you so much,
Darcy.
Ethel. If I could just interrupt this great question and conversation for one moment, just to enhance some of the access for our viewers, if I could ask the panelists to please announce yourself when you're speaking, we'd be really, really grateful. And if there are words that you think may benefit from spelling, we'd appreciate that as well. Thank you so much for this quick pause, and looking forward to getting
Thank
back
you,
to the
Darcy.
conversation. Thanks.
Go
This
ahead.
is Ethel speaking. Thank you, Carol. And I think the question of productivity is an interesting one, right? I think within the academy, we have become so embedded in this idea that we have to produce as much as possible in order to be seen as meriting inclusion, in order to be seen as valid. And I think what happens is, I keep going back to structures, right? What happens is that structures and institutional policies make people think that in order to meet these metrics, they'd have to produce more than what's required, especially for people of color, especially for racialized communities, especially for women. It's not enough to meet the bar. You have to exceed the bar. And so I think what's interesting, though, is that those of us who've done a lot of work on equity issues in the academy are understanding is that even if we do meet the bar, and even if we exceed the bar, and even if we've done the utmost that we can to meet all of these criteria for excellence, the rules still change anyway, right? The rules change. So all of a sudden, and this is true in my experience, oh, you've published too much. You're working
What?
too hard. Yeah, and that's so the rules of the game shift depending on the communities in question. So I don't want to kind of talk too much about that because that's very insider baseball. It's too much about the academic process, but I just kind of want to foreground that. The other thing is, capitalism has infused all of us, our daily lives, so much that there are apps that allow us to track our productivity, right? Some of us have Fitbits to make sure that we bring in our steps so we can work out. There are apps that, oh, you're wearing one. Yeah.
I want one,
There
I
are
have to say.
apps where you can put in how many hours you've written today for academics. And so I think because it's this notion that to be a worthwhile human being, you have to be productive, because that's part of our cultural mindset. It's hard to push back against that, right? And I think one thing that I am trying to unlearn, especially as I've witnessed, quite frankly, women in academia, people of color in academia, Indigenous professors in academia, get really burnt out and get really betrayed by the institutions that are supposed to be venerating them, that are supposed to be lifting them up. One of the things I'm trying to unlearn is this myth of productivity, because I've been a good academic, to be honest. I've published a lot. I've done a lot of the things I was required to do, and yet the rules still changed, right? When push comes to shove, the rules still changed. And when seeing a lot of my dear friends, a lot of my dear colleagues, a lot of my students themselves who, are worried about, their grades and are saying, if I don't make a good grade, then that means that I don't deserve to be at York, right? We're teaching our students this, not necessarily us individually, but the structures of the institution make it such that these are our expectations, right? One of the things that I've seen is that this has had tremendous health risks, right? A lot of women of color academics are dying earlier. And so one thing I'm trying to unlearn is the oft-stated adage, our rest is revolution, right?
Yes.
I do not need to keep feeding the beast. I do not need to stay up till 4 a.m. to try to finish that article one thing I saw on Twitter, and I'll just kind of end my remarks on that note, is, this person, and I'll kind of attribute them and share it with Carol later because I can't remember, but just to paraphrase, one person said, you don't want to show the best part of yourself at work. You want to show the best part of yourself at home when with your family. And I find that that's constantly reversed. I'm so stressed out with my work. I'm so invested in becoming a good academic that I bring the best parts of myself at work, and I get really irate and really annoyed with my family for getting in the way of my ability to work, when it should be the other way around, right? We shouldn't be resentful that our parents and our family members want our attention. We shouldn't give them the worst side of ourselves. We should give them the best side of ourselves. And so I'll just encourage everyone to just kind of unlearn this mentality and consider that you're worthwhile regardless of how much you work. You're worthwhile as a human being. And that might seem really naive and really simple, but I think it bears repeating because a lot of us have bought into this myth that to be worthwhile is to be productive. And I think we should all unlearn that.
Thanks for that, Ethel. And definitely the cult of productivity is more than just, because most of us probably think about the Amazon example. If you're like me, I always read anything about, like the features on Amazon's work culture. They have this work culture they call burn and churn. That is, they do mass hiring because they expect people to burn out anyway, right? So unbeknownst to many of us, the culture is not just Amazon's, right? Because as Ethel said, it's almost like, it's everywhere. It's, it exists even in the academe. Now, I know Soma has this ongoing engagement with an ideal university. If such an ideal university, and you can walk us through this, existed, what would be like the position or the valuation of care work that we hope such an ideal could include?
Right. Thank you. Just wanted to kind of say that I'll be speaking as someone who has recently lost 3 colleagues, like either, like as Ethel was saying, either to burnout, and also because of rules changing. So I'm actually grieving they're leaving academia. I'm happy for them that they left, but I'm also grieving because they're wonderful friends, colleagues, and insightful scholars. So I'm coming from that, headspace. I wanted to kind of little bit first talk about this, and I have already touched on it a little bit, the relationship between reproductive and productive work. Like, so we talk about this productivity. Who is a productive academic? Honestly, I thought about, and I kind of felt it to my bones, the politics of care work and reproductive work during the pandemic. But could I turn it into a special issue or $1 million grant? No, I couldn't, because there was no support, no acknowledgement of reproductive work, the work of socially reproductive labor. There was no acknowledgement of that. So I was not what you would call a productive academic, because I could not turn that life experience into a sellable commodity that would prop up the university, that would boost its ranking, that would make it into a high grant hitting institution, right? And so there's a clear relation, like contradiction. Actually, it's a relationship of contradiction between productive and reproductive work. So that's what I wanted to say. And I also, before I get to the question of another university, not like really an ideal university, but this notion of another university, I also wanted to talk a little bit about this rest and politicizing rest, and mostly because I am on sabbatical, and my 8-year-old recently actually told me that she was not aware I was on leave. That was a wake-up call for me. And that is because I am picking up the pieces from the 2 years of pandemic and piled up work. So 8-year-olds are prescient. They know, they get it. They figured us out, right? So this overwhelmed parents, and not our good sides for the families that we keep, right? As Ethel was saying. I wanted to say that, this whole idea of sabbatical when the world is burning, that has been, on my mind a fair bit. And I feel like, you go on sabbatical, you work frantically for so many years, health hazard, burnout, as my colleague was saying, all of that. And then you go on sabbatical, and then you realize the sabbatical is actually not rest in a political sense, like, a political understanding of rest and rejuvenation. Sabbatical is not really that. It's a break. It's basically a break so you can actually recover. A long time ago, when I was in graduate school, actually, one of my colleagues told me, that, for a racialized female immigrant academic with a young child, the first sabbatical is most likely a recovery. Right? And so you recover. And I was wondering, I thought about that a lot. And I was like, what am I recovering for? I'm recovering because so I can go back and keep producing. Right? And then in another way, the relationship between, productive and reproductive work. So my going back from sabbatical and keeping on producing actually reproduces the institution through peer-reviewed articles, through grants, through all of that, right? So that's another way we can think about the relationship between production and reproduction, that we also reproduce the university. Now, I know I'm kind of talking a lot, but I'm just quickly going to talk about this idea of another university, Carol. I know you and I had a brief chat about it. So this is Akwogo Emejulu, who is a British sociologist, who has been kind of talking about this, writing about this idea of another university in relation to pedagogy and curriculum. But her work actually has allowed me to think about this, what does it need, like, what should change? What needs to change in our institutions? So care work is not considered a hurdle, not considered a problem that we need to strategize around, right? What needs to change in our institution, whether at all it's possible given the current structures, current institutional structures. And I think Ethel also mentioned hitting the metrics, right? Like whether at all it is possible for the university to be caring, or caring institution that cares for caregiving subjects, right? And this is not a call for including the caregiving subject. This is actually, I'm not making a call for inclusion. I'm just kind of posing a question, like the way the current institutional structures work, is it possible to make care and care work front and center, bring it front and center in this institutional structures? Yeah.
So we're actually getting quite a few comments and questions. And I'd like to invite maybe Ola and Alana can go first. In terms of a follow-up question, I also prepared this similar follow-up question. So in terms of getting more support, for instance, or if I may be so bold to connect it to our broader Inclusion Week theme, in terms of solidarity and allyship, for example, what kinds of support do you envision, for example, for the social activism that you do, Ola and Alana? What types of support do you imagine can make a difference, especially for those in BIVSAA, for example, who have to bear the brunt of anti-racism work, for example, right? Raising other students' awareness, etc. How do you imagine, the types of support that you would welcome in terms of allyship and support?
Yeah, well, I would say, like all allies are welcome and to come and support the movement, but I would say sometimes, like, they're all excited to come and support, and they kind of take control or control the movement and control the narrative, which is not what we're asking for. But we get the excitement, for a change and support, but just to be mindful that people are sharing their experience, their trauma, and just to sit down and just listen. And then when you do get into rooms that you have privilege and power, to open the door for people who should be in the room as well, to give in their input of the people that are being oppressed. Because I feel like for an allyship, when it comes in a place of fear, or you are prioritizing your comfort over the comfort of people who are being oppressed, that is not effective, and it's even more damaging.
It's also more work, emotional
Yes, it is.
labor.
Yes, it is. It's very, very emotional work. When I took over for Tenny and Mo and have Alana as my co-president, I knew it was going to be work, but I wasn't aware of the emotional barrier, like the emotional side of this work, and having to go into rooms and saying like experiencing our trauma, and then having some people say or maybe like kind of invalidate the experience or the emotions that we're experiencing. So that really was definitely a learning curve, I would say. So again, yeah, just this is definitely emotional work. It's messy work. And we would just like to see that obviously people are going to make mistakes and say the wrong things. It's just not to prioritize your comfort over the comfort of people being oppressed. That's what I would say.
Thank you for that, Ola. And I'm glad you brought that up. And it's cropped up a lot in our conversation. I just wanted to acknowledge, that the feminists gave us this terminology of emotional labor. Emotional labor or management is that extra or added layer of labor in which most of the time women have to perform this, right? In relationships, in families, in communities. And it's very much the same thing you're talking about when we have to deal with the fragility of, of people who might think, oh, I want to be an ally, but then you end up having to manage all those emotions, right? When they do participate. So it's interesting. Was there anything you wanted to also raise on that's related?
Yeah, because I would also say that you can identify as your ally. Yeah, that's the first step. But are you going to be in rooms that if you speak up, you also might get sidelined or even in trouble for speaking up for inequalities? That's the part we're looking for. Not everyone can say that they're ally, but are you going to work at it? Are you going to sacrifice yourself for the greater good for people who are being oppressed? So that's what I would add.
Thank you so much for that. Alana, is there anything you'd like to add that's related to that?
I think Ola, you worded it perfectly. That's exactly what BIVSAA stands for. We kind of were put into these big meetings to try to shake up the room a bit. We don't want anyone to feel comfortable by the end of it. I think that if everything was all good, then there wouldn't be any space for BIVSAA. I think we were I guess this alliance was formed to shake up the room a bit and try to have eye-opening conversations in order to grow. So Ola, you worded it perfectly, and you got the point across.
This actually relates to something I read recently, and I came across, and maybe Soma and Ethel, you can address this. I was reading about how social work is also, very akin to care work, because when you do social work or in its related area of social justice work, you do take on causes, and you challenge structures for others, not just for yourself, right? So there is a community element. And I know Ethel has done excellent work on talking about the political participation of care workers and how that is like a step towards I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I think you were talking about it as a way they also um, promote their well-being, right? And it's not just engaging in it for themselves, but it actually is kind of support work for bigger communities, even a transnational migrant worker community, because in the end, when you challenge these structures, it doesn't redound to just your personal benefit, it spreads, right? So if you had anything in terms of responding to that, I sure welcome it.
I mean, I do want to have Soma speak, because I mean, I think the comparison between social work and care work, I'm not a social work professor,
Mhm.
and I think Soma, I'm sure, has a lot of things to say about that. But I will say really quickly, in terms of my own work, looking at migrant activism and also migrant care worker
Mhm.
activism, I think we all witness how in our own kind of daily lives, in our own kind of engagements with our families and friends and our communities, how important it is to have communities of care, right? Even as I speak, I have like several WhatsApp group chats checking in. I have like a no circle of people who talk to me and say, if I get an invitation, I ask them, hey, should I do this? And they'll say no, or they'll say yes, right? And I'm sure Alana, and Soma and other, and I think all of us understand this, right? Like we have a community of care around us to build us up and to remind us of our limitations and our boundaries too. And so it's important to realize that these are so essential. And for the care workers I'm working with, it's not just about like, maintaining these communities of care for themselves. It's also
Mm.
about looking at why care itself should be a better value that we as a society should uphold, as opposed to say productivity, right? But I
Mhm.
know that Professor Chatterjee probably has more to say with respect to social work as care work.
Actually, not, my friend. Social work is very broadly defined. It's its like biggest strength, and it's also its biggest limitations,
Okay.
because it doesn't really have clear bounded definition. There's multiple schools of thoughts within it. So I don't think actually the discipline or the profession is something that needs to be referred to at this
Mhm.
point.
Mhm.
Social work can also be, the whole idea of social workers being caring subjects is can be quite problematic as well, because it's just what ends up happening is that they are seen as people that mobilize resources and support, and but not really question. Ethel,
Mhm.
your work on Filipina care workers and the way they do these pre-arrival sessions, like orientation sessions,
Mhm.
and kind of learn to be this docile subject. I have read that article, and I kind of, it's just, we are social workers. We just know how to nicely say hello and hold hands and all that. Like extreme depoliticization that actually I don't sign up for.
Mhm.
So I really,
Mhm.
yeah.
Mhm. Oh, it's interesting you brought that up, that behind the scenes, we've actually been sharing readings with each other, and we'll have to find a way to share that with everybody else. But that is actually one aspect of your work, Ethel, that I wanted to ask about, was the guilt, right? That the guilt that comes alongside of taking rests, not working hard, not being productive. And this comes from the culture, being sort of taught, in this case, the case of Filipino migrant workers, the state itself telling them, programming them, that this is a life of sacrifice that you're preparing for. So even as many of us do struggle with that guilt about taking rests when we obviously will need to, the pressure is even greater for those sectors, right? So if you could speak to, what you were saying in the article about how this is part of the way the state, legitimizes its labor export program, for example. I'm talking about the Philippines.
I mean,
That
I'll
would be
speak a
good.
little bit on that briefly, but I
Mhm.
do want to shine a spotlight on Ola and what she said about allyship
Mm,
and
mhm.
communities of care and relationships of support, right? So, I mean, I think, we all kind of experience this as well. All of us, to a certain extent, not just Filipino migrant workers, have been socialized into thinking that we have to get the institution to love us, right? Like,
Yeah.
we have to get York University to love us. And so, in order to kind of prove to the institution that we're valuable, we're trying to, and Soma can affirm this too. We're trying to show, look, we're doing all of this service work, we're producing so much, and yet the institution itself is like a faceless mess, and the institution will never love us, right? So that's one lesson that we've got to learn as well. But I wanted to go back to what Ola was saying as well, because I think with respect to communities of care and allyship and the power of dissident friendships, what Ola said about true allyship resonates with me insofar as part of a community of care, as part of a community of support, allies are part of that too. And Ola, what you said about allies is not just being people who say, look, I'm an ally, I'm in it, but allies are actually the people who are willing to get oil spilled on them, who are willing to take hits. I think that allyship should be redefined to focus on that, and should also consider it's not just about performative allyship, it's also about people who are willing to do the work. And it's these allies that I think are so valuable in the communities of care that we structure for ourselves, right? And I just kind of wanted to elevate that and shout that out, because that's something that I've been thinking about, and I think that's really worthwhile. So thanks for that reminder.
Yes, that was an amazing point.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, Soma?
Yeah, I also wanted to quickly say that's a big shout out to that, because, hey, we have all seen that. I'm an ally, and then you have to get the Kleenex ready because there's so much tear and so much, and teaching, right? That going back to that emotional labor, like teaching people anti-racism and how to be an anti-racist ally, So yeah, I mean, that also reminds me of this, how I'm trying to bring the care work and COVID and the pandemic politics now into my classrooms. And I do not want to ask people for their stories and for their experience, because there's already, COVID and care work is almost like a genre in its own right. If I want to bring it to classroom, I am committed to actually doing the learning as someone who has actually, you know, haven't been really greatly affected by the pandemic, that white collar job, right? Like that saved me and my family a little bit. I cannot just go and ask people for their stories of, okay, how did you survive and how did you experience it all. I want to actually engage the literature that is already out there, learn on my own some of the frontline realities, and then kind of engage with that pedagogically and bring it to my classroom and things like that. Yeah, so allies that are willing to, and I understand what Ola you're saying, that allies that are really engaged, that are willing to take the risk.
Mm.
So thank you for that point. Yeah.
So let's begin by reading some of the questions. I hope we can cover as much. So Emily, first of all, says thank you for this panel and the panelists. Um, and she makes the point that how can we make visible the relations of care and care work that are so fundamental to our collective health and well-being in such a way that policy and decision makers cannot deny their importance. That's the $1 million question, right? But I guess Emily is interested in particular strategies if that's already something you're trying to do in your work. How do we actually, for me personally, I thought COVID, happening and then was going to be a big opportunity. Of course, there were opportunities, but all people did was the noise thing. But yeah, how do we make it more visible, perhaps, right? Uh, the requirements of care and care work that are so important for health and well-being. So they could be disruptive, like bringing home. Well, I guess that has to be post COVID and restrictions. In the past, I guess some people bring their children to work. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I can go a little bit. The question is very much about, it calls for a maybe socially engaged scholarship research that kind of entangles with policy making and policy change. This is very much Ethel's, like Ethel does wonderful work, and so I'll let her speak mostly, but I'll just quickly say that I identify as an academic who works mostly within academia, and classrooms is my site. So that's my site, that's my only site, increasingly shrinking site for social justice work. So I have a very small community, for change making. The more opportunities for change making is quite constrained. But I find myself quite privileged that, there are hundreds of students that I get to work with every year. And I plan to bring, and pandemic has been a big teacher, right? Like I plan to bring all of that content. I have a course on pandemic social work actually. And I want to kind of work with my students with all these like learnings that took place and that continue to take place, because that is my site. And even at the end of it all, a few of them have a different understanding of what really happened in our world. It's not that we did not know about social hierarchies, but they were deepened. The pandemic actually followed the cracks in our society, the pre-existing cracks in our society. So even if they kind of walk out with, and they are students already bring enough understanding, like, I'm not doing 3 frontline jobs. Many of my students actually keep 3 jobs while doing my classes, so they are my teachers in many ways as well. So I want to kind of keep doing that work, making the pandemic a lesson, and then, students kind of taking those ideas to their workplaces for change to happen. Change is slow, I believe, and change is painstaking, right? It's slow and painstaking. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Did you have a response, Alana?
Yeah, I just wanted to go off what Soma was saying, because I'm at Glendon University, so our classrooms are pretty small too, but I just want to say that even though that site may be small, I think it's more impactful when the quality is getting distributed to the right people. I don't think it's more about the quantity. Even as for BIVSAA, we have a good group of people. It's not the biggest group, or as many people as like we would want. Like we would want all of York, but we really focus on the quality of people and how much they are willing to work, because at the end of the day, the job is not done, and it won't be done by the time we leave York. So we just need to keep the people that are willing to work hard around us, and that are satisfied with not seeing direct change tomorrow morning.
Thank you for that. We're getting a lot of interest from our audience, and also a lot of thank you for sharing some of those texts. We had an anonymous shout out, not a question, but a shout out. Thank you all for highlighting that capitalism only allows for rest through exploitation. Well, we definitely are touching those key learnings. One thing that keeps on running in my mind is, I believe, Soma, your essay that went viral in within the academe, at least I can vouch for that. Her reflection.
Viral, oh my God.
Because you were one of the earliest who reflected on, at the pandemic and how it was affecting all of us at that point. I believe you also quoted Nancy Fraser, who our favorite feminist. We always go to when we think about how, while social reproduction is so necessary for things to go on, for life to go on, and for capitalism to go on, on one hand, it's so necessary, it's fundamental. On the other hand, the orientation of capitalism to devalue it, care work, social reproduction, those types of work, is also, what's on the other side. That's also fundamental to it. And we keep going back, I know, to a lot of these aspects of care work, like emotional labor being the kind of labor that women are expected to handle. I wanted to, not because I'm running away from structural parts of the conversation, but I also wanted our audience to get to know us. In your life, and you don't have to give us full details. We already know Ethel and Soma, you care for children, but who cares for you? Who you do want to thank the person or community that sort of helps you rejuvenate, right? Who cares for you? Can we ask that of you? Let's start with Ola and Alana first.
Yeah, I would definitely say Alana. And my group
You
of
don't have to
friends.
tell us names, come on.
And like my other part of my soccer family and my other family, they definitely like continue to push me every time like come back. I'm like, guys, I'm so tired. But then they kind of like keep pushing me to continue on the fight. And even like when we do get off of hard calls, me and Alana just kind of have our moment to like rant, and then we make jokes, and then like we'll settle down and then like get back onto topic. And I feel like you just need spaces to like not talk about race or not talk about anti racist movements or any EDI work. You just need to get out and then go have fun or like do something that's different than your normal routine, and then you can come back. Because if you get stuck in that loop, I think you'll just definitely like tire yourself out and then kind of be very mad at the world, saying the world, like, so I guess I do have those moments, but I'm glad that I have a partner, Alana, and my other group of family that to continue just to keep me level head and like take me out of this space, and then I can come back fully recharged.
Amazing.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you, Ola. Like, Ola's literally my right hand. I think it's very important to have friends who can understand you on that level, and you can kind of confide in. But we also push each other. I think when I asked the question, oh, who cares for me? I would say my family, my mom, my dad, my sisters, just in the sense of even though they see, oh, I'm getting burnt out, I'm getting tired, there's never a day that goes by that they don't continue to motivate me. And I think it's that motivation or those words of wisdom that that allow me to keep going. But even outside of that, just being a part of BIVSAA this year, I think it opened my eyes to a whole other world outside of university. And I felt that especially through the pandemic, since that's all we were doing, school, I felt that my identity was kind of rooted in academics. And I was like, okay, so once I graduate, what else is there? And I think being a part of BIVSAA has opened up so many, it's opened my eyes so much, in the sense of there's so much work that needs to be done beyond these four walls of York. And if this is what you are so passionate about, then you should continue doing it. And I think I would support anyone in York University to get involved in different things, because yes, your grades are very important, but at the end of the day, they don't define you. I think Ethel was saying it earlier, but you have to find something that is your why you do certain things, or something that would motivate you, that is not based on marks or money or anything like that. So I think that's what answers the question. But yeah.
Thank you so much. Ethel and Selma?
I mean, I think you know, hearing Ola and Alana talk about their beautiful friendship makes me think about the power of dissident friendships. And that's a direct reference to a book that I like a lot. It is called Dissident Friendships, Feminism, Imperialism, and Transnational Solidarity by Elora Chowdhury and Liz Philippois. And I think, it's not just about who cares for us, right? Like, I mean, I would say I'm a migration scholar. It's like, essential farm workers who put
Mm,
produce in our grocery
yes.
shelves, right? It's my kids' daycare teachers. It's my kids' elementary school teachers. I mean, we have to look out and not just, at our
Mhm.
immediate circles. But I think there's something cathartic and empowering about dissident friends who, as Ola was saying, sometimes I don't want to talk about equity. Like, I'm sick of talking about equity. Stop asking me to talk about equity. I'm so exhausted by it. I mean, of course I'm talking about equity now, but sometimes I just want to kick back and talk about, Netflix and reinventing Anna, right?
Yes.
I mean, I'm asked to talk about equity, but I can never talk about the fun stuff that I do, right? And
Mhm.
so my dissident friends are the ones who check me in, who kind of remind me to rest, who are my no circle, but who also ask me, hey, have you binged this yet? Have you watched The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel yet? Right? Because we are multidimensional people, right? Like,
No spoilers.
I don't think about equity all the time, right? Like, so,
Yes.
I think dissident friends are people who can call you in and care for you in ways that, can allow you not to think about the heavy things we have to keep living and thinking about.
Fabulous. That's going to be Inclusion Week next year. Humor and dissident friendships. Soma.
Yes, yes. To all my panelist friends, you really nailed it down. I do not have to add anything, but I just wanted to, because Carol, you posed it as a personal space, personal question.
Mhm.
Yeah, I know. I also have to give a big shout out to my 8-year-old who just allows me to be silly and not think about anti-racism and work and grading and all of that. Also, my partner who actually picked up a lot of gendered care work while teaching himself during all these years of the pandemic, especially, but throughout my life. So that, and then
Mhm.
Ethel's comment about this dissident friendship that the book that you mentioned, if I have a couple of minutes, I would like to actually share a quote from the poet June Jordan, who I recently
Mhm.
read. And there's a couple of lines that really deeply resonated with me, because when it comes to like the question of who cares for me, I think about all the women out there like me,
Mhm.
whose experience have some similarities with mine, who probably are seeing me themselves in me as I'm talking now. So I
Mhm.
just want to read that
Go
line
ahead. Yeah.
from her work, Declaration of an Independence I Would Just as Soon Not Have. And she writes, I know I'm not alone. There must be hundreds of other women, maybe thousands, who feel as I do. There may be hundreds of men who want the same drastic things to happen. But how do you hook up with them? How do you hook up with that the years of isolation, the pandemic isolation, I have
Mhm.
thought about that. How do you hook up with these people? Because my experience is not individual, it is a social experience. It has happened and it's happening to many people, right? So how do
Mhm.
you hook up with them? Then I'm skipping some part, and then she writes, I don't know. I don't like it, this being alone. I don't like it, this being alone, when it is clear that there will have to be multitudes working together around the world. If radical and positive change can be forced upon the heinous status quo I despise in all its overwhelming power.
Thank you for that. Actually, time flew by. And again, on behalf of REI, I'd like to thank everybody who stayed on, and our panelists, especially, for such an engaged and delightful conversation. I, I learned so much, and there's so much to continue thinking about. And our hope here really is that our conversation today successfully challenged ordinary understandings of rest simply as a universal biological need. Clearly, our panelists help us to examine how the way people rest or the way people lack rest is not just shaped by our work, but it's also fundamentally determined by relations of power. So thank you. And with that, again, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I hope to continue following your work. Ola, Alana, Ethel, Soma, and thank you everybody. And do watch out for our other upcoming events this Inclusion Week.
Thank you.
Thanks.